Wow, wow, wowie, wow, wow, whoa, mama. Where to even begin with this one? I guess I should start at the beginning being when a 12-year-old boy fell in love with retro gaming, particularly of the jrpg variety. And y'all, when I tell you he got into retro gaming, I'm talking about games that at that point were only 7 or 8 years old. I guess it paid off to have been late to the PS2 party, though in other ways it certainly didn't. Whatever the case, our young whippersnapper developed a fondness for a not-so-bygone era of gaming, which led him to the shelves of his local Blockbuster, which carried and sold older games for some reason. Those very shelves would provide him with Final Fantasy VII, 8, and 9, his copy of Pokemon Yellow, Final Fantasy Anthology, and most importantly for this review, a copy of Final Fantasy Chronicles, which contained the PS1 release of Chrono Trigger. While Final Fantasy VII would claim the esteemed honor as the game to pop his up all night playing a video game cherry, Chrono Trigger would be the first JRPG he ever completed. 20 years later, good God, this boy would come back to it a full-grown man, at least in body, and be transported in mind and spirit back to that 12-year-old boy laying on his belly on the Berber carpet of his parents' suburban Ohio home, totally captivated once again by an epic time-traveling adventure. Initially developed and published by Square in 1995 for the SNES, the version of Chrono Trigger I played and will be talking about in this video is the one that was released alongside Final Fantasy IV in the Final Fantasy Chronicles collection for the PS1, which came out in 2001 and had a subsequent greatest hits run in 2003. Now, before proceeding, let's address the elephant in the room. Many consider this port of Chrono Trigger to be the worst, and for pretty good reason. Unforgivably, there are some long loading times at the start and end of battles, when moving between areas, and while using the in-game menus. Please don't misunderstand my use of the term unforgivably. These loading times are noticeably long, to be sure, but they aren't that bad. I've now played through this entire version of the game twice. I definitely notice it much more as an adult, but I still had a blast on my second playthrough. The reason I use the term unforgivably is because the version of the game we got, complete with this issue, should have never received the green light in my opinion. Like somebody with full knowledge of the SNES release of this game and how smoothly that played had to sit there looking at these awful load times and literally say, yeah, that's not that big of a deal. All that being said, I'm not a developer. Maybe this was the best they could do with the hardware at the time, coupled with the enhancements they brought to this particular release of the game. I don't know. The load times, for me at least, aren't the end of the world and certainly don't make this version of the game unplayable. They did, however, sometimes take me out of the game's experience because of how annoying and frequent they were, especially when I needed to use the menu to update equipment or give a character an item, etc. But with the glaringly obvious out of the way, let's get to the heart of the review. And I choose the word heart intentionally, because the main thing that struck me as I played through this ancient game again, closing in on 30 years, is how much passion went into this project. From the writing to the musical score to the ahead-of-its-time gameplay mechanics to the addition of Akira Toriyama-drawn FMV cutscenes, heart is in Chrono Trigger's very DNA. It's why this masterpiece has breathed new life time and time again, not only on the PS1 but also on the Nintendo DS, Steam, the PlayStation Network Store, and mobile gaming. I don't consider it an overstatement to say that Chrono Trigger belongs to a class of timeless games, and in this review I'll be discussing why I think that is. Let's start with the writing. Chrono Trigger takes us on a grand time travel fantasy adventure, complete with a missing princess, a talking frog, and a power-obsessed evil queen. Together with Chrono and a lovable cast of supporting characters, we must venture through time portals in order to right various wrongs set in motion by said evil queen and stop a literal apocalypse. On the surface, it sounds kinda hokey and convoluted, but I think what makes this work so well is the strong cast of characters. While Chrono might be the quintessential silent protagonist, his companions are anything but. As we worm our way more and more into the thick of the wibbly-warbly, timey-wimey stuff, sorry, couldn't resist, we come to learn so much more about what's personally at stake for each of Chrono's friends. As we pace ourselves over the main character, we let our emotions be tugged at so poignantly by a man-turned-frog who wants to prove that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, a sharp-tongued princess who just wants to make a more just and fair world, a genius inventor with a burning passion to have her capabilities capabilities acknowledged, a curious and compassionate robot who would sacrifice himself to ensure humanity's survival, a fiercely loyal chief who knows that at the end of the day, even her enemies, especially the formidable ones, deserve respect, and a former prince who would bend the fabric of time itself for the sake of his sister. All 7 characters, Chrono included, are united by one singular purpose, but each of their passions still shines so brilliantly, even if you might gravitate toward a certain party configuration because logistically, you can only have a party of 3, the game's storytelling will not let you forget about a single character. They are all integral in various ways to how this epic adventure unfolds. On very much a related note, another aspect of the writing that makes it shine overall is the complexity and depth of each and every important character and how the writers managed to convey that so effectively in every impactful scene. I feel like there are so many solid examples of this, but my new favorite is the final battle with Azala. As a kid, I definitely didn't appreciate the political nuances of Ayla's prehistoric era quite like I do as an adult, and my enhanced understanding only made the final showdown on the bridge of the Dino Lair that much more compelling. We stand before the leader of the Reptites in an epic battle that will once and for all decide which race gets to carry on and inherit the Earth as the dominant species, and which will be one step closer to dying out. I mean, regardless of who actually wins this particular fight, of the 2 races represented, the warm-blooded humans seem much more likely to survive the impending ice age that Lavos is about to usher in, but this showdown still feels so pivotal, and a large part of that is because on the surface, the Reptites seem far superior. They can talk in complete sentences and have much more advanced society in general, but part of their downfall comes from their own assumed superiority over Ayla and the other humans. Now, to be fair, I'm not sure Azala was counting on Ayla being aided by a group of time travelers. Maybe it wasn't exactly a fair fight. Regardless, we see on that bridge after a very intense battle a resigned Azala who has graciously accepted her fate, along with the fate of her entire race. Though the Reptites are more advanced, perhaps in this moment she finally realizes that the humans Ayla represents have always had more potential, and though there has always been a fierce enmity between their races, Ayla treats Azala in her last moments with dignity and respect, recognizing her for the fierce opponent that she was. Perhaps she too realizes that Azala and the Reptites, by virtue of their constant bid for dominance, played a pivotal role in her own species' advancement. Possible interpretations aside, one thing is certain. This scene brought me to tears. It was incredibly moving, especially because up until this moment, there had been a wall of prejudice against the Reptites kept up and encouraged by the writing. They were the bad guys. In terms of set pieces within the story's progression, Azala is a major villain. But then in this moment, the writers artfully tear down the wall and reveal this incredibly vulnerable moment. We're on Ayla's side up until this scene. She's our girl, and the Reptites are nothing but snobby bullies. And then, not even Ayla is totally on Ayla's side. And now all of this hits different. We can't walk away from this completely happy that we trounced the bad guys anymore. It's just not that simple, and it turns out it never was. And good God, this game is filled with moments like this. Yes, your choices can literally alter individual outcomes, but the writers don't shy away from exploring the uncomfortable consequences that ripple out from that one seemingly minor alteration. And this is one way that the excellence of the writing makes this feel like more than just a story we're being told. We take part in this in very real ways. Another way we see this agency is through the side quests toward the end of the game. I feel like I should also talk about the side quests as an aspect of the gameplay, but it would be irresponsible not to consider them from a writing standpoint as well. I always do side quests, not really because I'm a completionist, but more so because I want to give my characters every opportunity to be the best versions of themselves before the final showdown. I would feel like I failed them if I didn't do everything within my power to ensure they could approach the big bad putting their best foot forward. So of course, I did the side quests in Chrono Trigger. At least most of them, and boy howdy was I pleasantly surprised. I can't remember how many of the side quests I actually completed all those years ago, and I certainly can't remember how I felt doing the ones I did complete. All I know is somehow, somewhere, to zoom out for a second, in my decades of video game playing, side quests became almost entirely transactional. They added little to my experience of a game's story and were there primarily to give me overpowered equipment to provide an edge against the last hurdle of a game. Chrono Trigger reminded me of the side quest's full potential. Side quests absolutely should be challenging and give you good shit, as well as prepare you for the final battle, but they can and should also be integral to your experience of the story and immersion in the game's world. They should shape the outcome of the narrative in subtle and sometimes even profound ways. By nature, they're optional, but they did not feel that way at all. But the feeling of agency doesn't end there. The final thing I'll say about the writing is the thoughtfulness the writers put into an individual player's party composition at any given time. In a game with a decent amount of playable characters, there was a lot of thought put into whom you take along with you and when. Depending on who is in your party, you will see and hear different reactions to what is going on at various points in the game. This small but mighty detail helps sustain the notion that even your choice of party members matters. On subsequent playthroughs, it encourages you to break out of your comfort zone and think about party composition in a way that goes beyond mere utility. Genius. I could go on, I could gush more about the writing, but it's time to move on. And what better place to go next than the gameplay? Has it aged? Sure, but it was so innovative for its time, and it's important to appreciate that. Yes, there's a lot that looks familiar in terms of what other contemporary JRPGs were doing, such as time gauges and commands, but there were also some interesting nuances. For starters, the characters learned techs and magic spells. Not so radical yet, I know, but these special abilities could target single enemies, the entire field of enemies, or enemies that fell within a certain attacking path, whether that was a path in a straight line across the screen, or more like an AoE effect. On top of that, party composition not only mattered from a story immersion standpoint, but also from a tactical one. Some of your techs relied on certain party members also being on the field of battle to participate in the execution of those powered up abilities. The most commonly occurring were dual techs, but you could also perform extremely powerful triple techs utilizing the strengths of your entire party. This was such a cool idea that made combat so much more interesting. Additionally, instead of random battles, you had enemies running about on the map and even swooping down from the air or jumping out of bushes to surprise you. As someone who has played a lot of games with random battles, this was a much appreciated change-up. I'll also add that there is a way to avoid random battles by standing completely still. Some enemies that only engage when you actually bump into them will not recognize your presence, even if they walk right over you. You'll want to wait until they're decently far away before you start moving again, but this is a pretty reliable way to avoid a lot of annoying battles, especially if you're revisiting areas for loot or whatnot. I know this has mostly been a gush session so far, but here's the time I actually bring in some criticism. First and foremost, the battle menu is mostly straightforward and clean cut, but it can wind up blocking view of where the enemies actually are in the battlefield, which can be a bit annoying and disorienting. It also just looks bad and distracts from the excitement of a battle when it's blocking the view like that. One late game example of this is the second Queen Zeal fight on the Black Omen. In this instance, it's actually the separate battle narration bar that gets in the way at the top of the screen. While your targeting cursor is visible when targeting either of Queen Zeal's hands, it is completely blocked from view by the pesky text box when targeting her head. You get used to it, but it's annoying and distracting at first. Also, navigating the battle menu and then selecting your enemy target can be slow and tedious, especially when you're trying to select a specific tech to use on a specific enemy. And if you've opted for active instead of time, this can wind up biting you in the ass a little bit. It's only a nibble, but I don't remember pulling down my trousers and giving the go-ahead for that. Speaking of minor inconveniences in trousers, I feel like the developers got a little too big for their britches when it came to the Death Peak section in 2300 AD. As you attempt to make your ascent up this treacherous mountain for very important, spoilery story reasons, there are some events that you'll have to take part in order to not fall off or be swept away by the winds of Satan at certain points. It was a fine idea to make the gameplay more interesting than just fighting enemies and solving minor puzzles, but we were just not there yet. This was more of a pain point during the narrow mountain pass sequence, but shielding yourself behind the trees during the first hurdle also gave me more trouble than it should have. But yeah, the portion where you had to run across a very narrow chunk of mountain with very little room for error was substantially more frustrating. Most of us were using D-pads which just weren't built for that kind of precision, and to be successful at this you also had to sprint. This was a recipe for broken controllers and TV sets, and it really emphasized the shortcomings of this game in a very unnecessary way. This is a JRPG, guys, not a platformer, and this section made that fact way too painfully obvious. Before we get to quite possibly the best part of Chrono Trigger, let's just briefly talk about the FMVs that were added for the PS1 release. They are top quality for sure. My god, they are beautiful and I'm so happy they exist. But the mere fact that the exact same scene is then repeated by the in-game sprites because that's how it happened in the original, I mean, I get it, but really? We couldn't have removed those portions from the game since the FMVs were far superior renderings. There was just no way to do that. I'm not gonna lie, seeing the same scene repeated again took some of the momentum out of some pretty pivotal moments. Again, I'm not a game developer. It just feels like there might have been a way to delete those pixelated portions of the game in the updated version. Not a huge deal again, but something I noticed in a not so good way. Okay. We've quite possibly saved the best for last, folks. The music. Good freaking god. The music is absolute perfection. No notes. I mean, it's music, so I guess there are a lot of notes, but no notes from me. You're welcome. Suffice it to say, I don't think there's another game on this planet with a soundtrack that fits so perfectly in terms of inspiring the right emotions at every turn, as well as a soundtrack that reveals the creative ingenuity of the composer. Like, I enjoyed the feels, but it was also so delightful to hear all the surprising twists each composition took on both musical and thematic levels. Just like the narrative, each track takes you on one hell of a ride. And with that, we're coming to the end of my review. So what exactly does make Chrono Trigger so timeless? Honestly, I think it comes down to the molecular level. There are so many pieces that all come together so perfectly, from the music, to the writing, specifically the characters, to the character-centric battle system, to the epic eon-spanning size of the adventure. We may start with something that seems to steer a little too close to worn-out staples of the fantasy genre like frog princes and evil queens, but we quickly move leaps and bounds beyond anything remotely derivative. And how? How does this legendary team manage to pull that off? Heart. Every character along for the ride with us feels so real. Yes, the fate of the world is literally at stake, but so is the fate of each party member's individual, cherished world. The way the writers so expertly and intricately weave those two facets together is pure poetry. Though I hadn't really touched this game in 20 years, it had a profound and formative impact on me back then, and I'm so glad that I revisited it. I have a couple more side quests to complete and some endings to see, but that's just gonna be for me. And let me just do a little side note here on the side quests and the multiple endings. I made a post on social media where I kind of talked about how I'm getting teary-eyed and a little sad because I have to say goodbye to this game because I'm approaching the ending. And some people made the comment, well, there are 14 endings, so you actually have a lot more work to do. And while I can recognize, yes, that's correct, one thing that kind of came to my mind is that that's a yes and no scenario. Like, yes, there are multiple endings and I have a bit more work to do. But also, I want to be true to my experience and how I enjoy a game, which is primarily through the story that's being told and that I'm taking an active role in as the player. And the way I enjoy and experience that is from start to finish. And yeah, there are multiple endings and there are other things to see, but a lot of that continuity is interrupted when all you're doing is hunting down the various endings and meeting the requirements to see them. And so, like, yeah, those people were right, and that's valid, and that adds to the replayability of the overall game, but that's not really a draw for me. Getting one ending from Chrono Trigger is enough for me, and it's the journey, it's the whole experience, the continuity of it that is beautiful to me. With any game, that's and kind of making that post, reading the comments from other people who, as I said, are correct. It's made me kind of, it's made it crystallize for me why I've always kind of chafed at people who kind of put stock into, oh, well, this game has multiple endings. Like, yeah, that can be a draw, but it doesn't have to be, and it certainly isn't for me. I think because Chrono Trigger deals with time travel and the consequences of kind of seemingly insignificant decisions, whether you decide to do something or you don't, and how that affects the overall trajectory, that's fascinating. But it's still not really the most important thing for my experience of a game. It's the story and the journey of that story. I've kind of gone off script here, but I think it was worth it. And that's where I'm coming from when I say that what I wanted to experience and then capture in this review is the strength of the gameplay experience from beginning to quote-unquote end. While I recognize the value of multiple endings in terms of replay value, I'm a literature nerd. I enjoy a good story, and that's that. Whether that's you as well, or you enjoy the surprises contained within multiple endings and burning what-ifs, this game won't let you down. And if I've conveyed nothing else, I hope I've made it abundantly clear that "won't let you down" is such an understatement. Chrono Trigger might be almost 30 years old at this point, but it will make you love all that video games can do.